have the unenviable position of speaking just before lunch. And I know that it's been a long but good morning, and we've had wonderful presentations. Appreciate Dr. Weima's talk, which there's a lot of relationship between the issues that are affecting the churches in the 7 cities. That's because they share a similar culture. And so each city has its own unique situation, strengths and weaknesses that they're facing, as well as other challenges. So there's going to be a good bit of overlap in some of the matters that are being addressed. One of the things that older scholars of Revelation used to talk about the background, what motivated the vision and the writing of it, was that the churches were experiencing an empire-wide persecution, and they were all suffering miserably. And what we find, both through historical records as well as a careful study of the text, that when you look at the 7 cities and the churches and the things being addressed there, you find a different situation at work. So typically, I would look at like the challenges, both either external or internal. So there's situations where they're facing external opposition. So in Pergamum, you have a situation, and the only person actually named as being killed for Christ is Antipas. You do not find mass death. You do have a reference in Smyrna to coming imprisonment and some other challenges. And then you also find internal problems where there's compromise with the pagan idolatrous system and false teaching. And so Thyatira is one of those where the problem is much, much more internal in the body of Christ in that city. Even though that internal problem is really a result of some of these cultural pressures, particularly related to guilds and the worship of various idols and those practices. Now, very quickly, before I get into it, I'm going to do, basically, I want to look at Thyatira from a telescope, and to get the broad panoramic, a little bit about its location, its history, its religion, its economic situation, and then we're do more of a microscopic analysis of the letter, where we'll walk through the letter. Now, one of the things that, and the reason why I chose Thyatira, and I've written and published several articles and a book related to Revelation, and I argue that there's this lawsuit theme taking place. But in the analysis of the 7 letters, as Dr. Weima pointed out, there is within each of these letters, which is often what they're called, a very definable structure. It's very easy to see. I refer to them as messages, or better yet, I think of them as prophetic oracles. Jesus speaking directly to his churches. In the Old Testament, we find prophetic lawsuit speeches where God is the judge and the prophet is calling forth witnesses, often the sun and the moon and the mountains, and reminding them of what God has done for them, reminding them of their covenant stipulations, what it means to be in relationship with this holy God, where they failed, warnings of judgment, and calls to repentance. So I find a very similar structure taking place where Christ is investigating his churches. He's analyzing them. He's calling them out. He's saying, I know both the good and the bad. And he's calling them to repentance. He's calling them to action. Interestingly, right, Revelation is the only book of the Bible that promises a blessing just to read it. But it also promises a blessing, more particularly, to those who obey it. Not to get controversial here, but I often tell people, if Revelation is only about the future, far off from its time of writing, then how do you obey that? As a book of prophecy, Jesus is instructing his churches. John is giving a message to the churches, not just in the 7 messages, but the entire book, calling them to obedience and action. And there's not a lot of guesswork into what he is asking them to do. Radical faithfulness to King Jesus. We've talked a lot about the empire. We've talked a lot about some of those issues related to the imperial cult, imperial claims of divinity and power. They're under a dominion. They're under a kingdom, the Roman one, with its king. But they are to live as citizens of another kingdom. And they are long awaiting the return of their king, who will usher his rule and reign, his kingdom, over all creation. But in the meantime, they're marginalized. Living in the United States, where Christianity has been a large part of our culture, we enjoy the freedoms and privileges of it, and it's interesting to see when things like pandemics come up and they're asked to wear a mask and some of the responses, because we have this sense of entitlement, this freedom, and we expect everybody to kind of share this Christian worldview. But in the ancient world, it's the exact opposite. They were the minority. They were viewed with suspicion and skepticism. They were the small group that were going against the flow, and that often created conflict. Not just in terms of government, but also in terms of just their daily life, their own families, and living and operating in their cities. One of the things, very quickly, before I get into it, all this is just preface, is I think there's also a structure to the 7 messages as a whole. And if you look at it, using this illustration back here, you have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, and we could talk all about the route that would have taken. But if you look, there's 7 of them. Where is the center of those 7? Thyatira. It is a center point. Interestingly, right, it is the longest of the 7 messages. I don't think that's an accident. I think there's a purpose there. I also would even argue, and we'll talk about this in a moment, where I think the theological center of the letters is also in this message, as well as perhaps even a structural center. But the reason I point that out is because I think embedded in the message to Thyatira is much of the point of the entire series of 7 messages. So kind of the way I think about it, and I asked to borrow a copy of this, is much like Mark's cover here. While it makes a V for victory, it also would put that centerpiece. One quick structural argument to support this: you have that call to the hearers. Those with ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. Right? And then there's the promise to the overcomer. To the one who overcomes, I will give, and so forth. In Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, the order follows: to the one who has ears, I will give. Starting with Thyatira, through the rest of them, that order is reversed. The one who overcomes, I will give. Let the one with ears hear. Now that's a subtle thing, but I think that kind of creates almost like a mirror parallel, centering it here with Thyatira. Now, kind of for a telescopic view, when we're looking at Thyatira's location, it was actually, in some ways I was like, man, I wanted to talk about it before we went, but now that we've been there, right, that really saves me a lot of time. Because you've seen it, and you've seen what's not there in terms of archaeological remains. Obviously, because the modern city. The other church where there's not much is Philadelphia. But Thyatira, there's not a whole lot there. You can see where it is located. I'm used to having a screen behind me. You can see where it's located on the map. The ancient city of Thyatira may not have had the power and the prestige of Pergamum or the wealth of Sardis. You'll hear about Sardis after lunch. But it was famous in the ancient world for both its highly organized trade guilds, collegia, associations, and it was especially known for its technology in producing purple, which was a particular type of purple nicknamed Turkish red, from the madder root as opposed from the muric shells. As a city of commerce and manufacturing, Thyatira became well known for many of its trades. Both inscriptions and literary references mentions trade guilds from everything from wool, linen, leather, bronze, dye, tanning, pottery, baking, and there's at least 7 inscriptions dedicated to its dyeing industry. So when we think about the message to the church at Thyatira, I want you to put this in the context of this is a center for production of lots of products. And that is important because with that, man, I'm trying to say where I talk about things, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it, and if I repeat myself, repetition is the best form of learning. You know, we often, in a modern people, Western people, we have this naive concept of people in the ancient world. Often in movies, I like to watch any movie about a historical period, the hero is often an atheist. A hero is often a one, if it's set in Greek or Roman times, they're often challenging the gods, and they're denying that. But the reality is, the Greco-Roman world was inherently, deeply religious. Every aspect about it. The Roman soldiers, one of their favorite gods, I forget its name, but he was god of the boots. And every time they put on their boots and tied their laces, they said a prayer to this god. Every aspect of life was governed by the gods. One of the things that you'll see in all the various sites is the adoption of all kinds of deities. And often they were grouped together, associated, sometimes Artemis is identified with Diana and so forth. But the Romans, they didn't want to offend any gods, so they adopted every god they heard about. Right? Whether it was a local deity, a deity from Egypt, a deity from somewhere else, they wanted to worship all the gods. So, going back to the persecution of early Christians, I believe it's Tacitus that tells us, one of the charges leveled against Christians was atheism, which was seen as a horrible crime. Now, the atheism here is not, there is no God, but rather the Christians were saying, there is only one God, and you should only worship Him. And the reason why that was such an affront was because a well-ordered society, particularly related to economy, everybody cares about economics. We all want money to buy food, to provide for our family. Money's not just flowing and growing on trees, right? So the well-ordering of society, avoiding plagues, all these good things happening, you have to appease the gods. And if something bad's happening, the gods are angry. And the same is true for any sort of merchant or trade or industry. All of them that were necessary for participation in that particular trade. Now I say all that to help frame much of what the issue is for the believers in Thyatira. Now Thyatira is only mentioned a total of 4 times in the New Testament. It is mentioned once in Acts, right? Acts 16:14 with the mention of Lydia. Now Lydia is not in Thyatira. Where is she? Philippi, right? So here she is. She is, the word used in Greek says that she is a seller of purple. She is not a dyer. She is a merchant. She is a seller. So she's likely connected with one of the guilds, the purple dye guilds in Thyatira. That's her home. That's where she's from. Thyatira is in the region of Lydia. Some commentators point out that it might not be her name. Her name might be something else, but everybody called her Lydia because she was from Lydia. I don't know. But she is there living in the Roman colony of Philippi, and she would have been a woman of means. She wouldn't have been at the highest tier of society, but she would have been well-to-do. Part of the evidence of that is she invites Paul and Timothy and Silas and Luke to stay in her home. And the church in Philippi had its origin in Lydia's home, which would have been large enough to host a group to stay there. She also becomes a patron, a benefactor of Paul. There's at least 3 references in the New Testament where Paul receives an offering of money from the church at Philippi. And I believe that Lydia was also somebody who helped fund much of Paul's ministry. Lydia is one of my favorite characters in the ministry of Paul. I think she is an unsung hero, partly because the irony of it, Paul's in Alexandria Troas. He has a dream. He's looking where to go. He has a dream of what? A man. A Macedonian man. So they're like, well, we should go to Greece. We should go to Europe. He gets there, and who's the first convert? A woman from Asia. Right? And so I think Lydia is a very significant person, but it also is a testament to just how, we talked about travel and the ancient internet, right? In Hierapolis, there's a tomb of a merchant that records 72 visits to Rome. So travel, even though they didn't have cars and whatnot, there was still a lot of movement taking place. So there's a lot of connection where, even though they're separated by geography. Anyway, so Lydia is mentioned, and then it's mentioned 3 times in Revelation, primarily in the address to the church. It's briefly mentioned in other ancient writers such as Appian, Polybius, Strabo, Diognetus Laertius, Pliny the Elder, and Titus Livius or Livy. Now, Thyatira, or modern Akhisar, was situated on the northwest part of the region, the ancient kingdom of Lydia. And it's on a broad, fertile plain on the Lycus River. So it's part of that very famous, we're see also with Laodicea, Hierapolis, all of that is part of a very fertile area with the Lycus. And it lay among an imperial road that would extend from Pergamum down to Sardis, down all the way to Laodicea, where it would merge with another road that would go from Ephesus. So looking at a map here, we've seen these maps. I won't belabor it, but you can just see its relationship. It is nestled nicely between Pergamum and Sardis, and that's the reason actually for its existence. And here's just a different map, just singling it out, kind of showing you its location. I took this picture off of a website of modern Akhisar, just to give you kind of an overview. One of the things I want you to see from this aerial photo is what's missing. Hills, thank you. Yeah, besides all the ancient ruins, right? What's missing is hills. And so you can see that this is a very flat, broad space. Thyatira was not built like a Pergamum as a citadel. It was not built on a massive acropolis that can't be conquered. It was actually just an open field. Makes it a very strategic place for military battles as well. Here's just some older illustrations of Thyatira, probably from 100 plus years ago, found. And then I believe this is where we visited yesterday, Cemetery Hill. I know it's a little bit of a downer after coming off the Acropolis at Pergamum. Right? You're like, wow! You're like, this is it. I get that. There's just not a whole lot there. And that's partly because we just, it's probably not good form to dig under people's houses for the sake of ancient rocks. So, we're very limited in what we can see in material culture, the ruins. It's not the most impressive sight. But don't let that lead you to think that the letter or the city itself was not impressive. So here is a Tuku map that you can find in your guide that gives you a little bit of a better spread. So we looked at the area where those remains are, Cemetery Hill, the Acropolis, and it's just because my Turkish isn't as good as it needs to be or existing much at all. I'm not going to try to pronounce the names and the modern places, but Hospital Mound is where the Acropolis was. So there is some work being done. There's some excavations taking place there. That gives you a sense. It's just not a whole lot. And I'm gonna speed through a lot of these because you saw them. You had plenty of time to look at them and walk through them. The basilica, and of course the colonnaded street. This is what it looked like unrestored. This is how I've seen it before. So it was really nice to see it with the stoa and the arches, kind of reconstructed to give you a better sense of it. And of course there you see some of the arches laying there. There's a little bit of work done at the Acropolis. And one of the things that I would just mention, milestones, and I've been friends with Mark for about 15 years, I guess, and he's deeply influenced me in a number of ways. One of them is I am obsessed and fascinated with Roman roads now. The construction, the detail, as well as milestones. And there is a milestone, one of the milestones outside of Thyatira as you go toward the city. It actually gives the inscription, 7 miles to the great, the most great city of Thyatira. I don't think these were just bragging rights, right? I do think that people were proud of the places they lived, and I think it is reflective that these cities were beautiful. Even if you just look at the broken remains around, you can see such artistry and detail in the designs. So, and I believe this is correct, but I believe this is gladiator scenes. Just on a relief here, right, the sports pages of the ancient world. So let's kind of get into the history a little bit. There's not a whole lot known about its history. There's very little that's remarkable about it, but there is some things that are connected to it. So in 281 BC, there was a battle of Corpindium, where it was fought between the two Diadocoi, the kings, the Greek kings, Seleucus I and Lysimachus. Now, as you know, right, after the death of Alexander the Great, who conquered from Macedonia all the way to India, right, his death that territory was divided among his 4 generals. So Cassander got Macedonia, Lysimachus, Anatolia, right? Seleucus is Syria and the Levant, and then you have Ptolemy in North Africa and Alexandria. Now, here's what's going to happen, right? Seleucus is kind of moving his territory in, right? He's going west, and that butts up against Lysimachus. So there was a battle there, and afterwards, right after Seleucus beat Lysimachus, he resettled and refounded the Lydian city Tara, which means fortress or stronghold, and kind of refounded the city as Thyatira. And so that's kind of really its modern start, right? It was first really occupied with soldiers, and in many ways, Thyatira retained its militancy, its heritage, coming from these Greek soldiers. And it became one of the oldest Hellenistic settlements of Asia Minor. Now, what makes it such a significant city and why it was established is it really is a borderline city. It is a borderline to Pergamum to the west and the Syrians to the east. And so it's kind of, if you think of it, as a stronghold, a military camp city, a place to set up your soldiers. Now, it's not a city like Pergamum and others that we've seen that has natural defenses, right? It's It's subject to repeated invasions, and throughout its history, it was invaded by the Galatians, the Attalids, and the Syrians, and so forth. But really, its strength and what led to its fame had more to do with the fertility and the productivity of its surrounding territory. So it was a place that was set up for battles, but it was also a place that was set up perfectly for its future economic and trade business. Ultimately, Rome defeats Antiochus III in 189 BC, and they surrender to Rome, but Rome makes them part of the Pergamum kingdom, the Attalid kingdom. And so, from this time, they really just become part of almost like a sister city of Pergamum. And it kind of has peace and prosperity. Under the Emperor Claudius, they become even more prosperous and are even able to issue their own coinage. And we can see that also during the imperial period is really where the city begins to grow and build with the citizenry, the demos, and various private donors, building up the civic spaces, the colonnades, ornamental gateways, and a gymnasium. Now, and I know you probably are getting hungry, so I'm trying to move through this as quickly because I want to get into the letter some before we dismiss. I thought deeply about, well, because it's so well known for its trade guilds, to begin with that, but instead I decided to begin with its religion. And the reason is for the very reason I said, everything, even its economics, was tied into the religious culture. Now, it was apparently first founded as a shrine city for a Lydian sun god named Thyatira. And then later, Thyatira was identified with Apollo Delphia, or Pythia, which relates back to the god Apollo, and the Oracle of Delphi, where he slew the serpent, and it was a very famous place. So it was kind of merged together. And he really becomes this, Apollo Trimnios becomes the distinct patron deity of Thyatira. And he's featured all over in their coinage. Now, I chose this coin. Unfortunately, it doesn't show everything very well. But it has him riding on the back of a horse with what's called a bipenis, or a double-edged sword. And then another god, which was probably once again a local goddess that was merged with Artemis, is Artemis Boratini. And these two were the two patron god and goddesses that you find often on their coinage, very highly associated with the city, and in the priest of Apollo and the priestess of Artemis were husband and wife. They were married. And the high priestess would perform the ceremony with various mystery religious rituals as well. You also see that on the back of this coin is the god Lycus, for the Lycus River, resting there on some rocks. Other gods and goddesses that you find throughout the Roman period would include Athena, Tyche, Hercules. And there you see a better picture of the bipenis, the double-edged axe. And I just want to do this. I was so excited. I was the only one excited about this. Where the bus is parked, there was a sign with the emblem for the city of Akhisar. And on it, and I'm sorry for the poor visibility here, but on it, what is featured prominently on their modern symbol? The same double-edged axe. So that actually goes back to just their entire history. The double-edged axe probably represents power and justice and judgment and so forth. You also find Tyche, goddess of prosperity, good fortune, blessing, Asclepius. And then we find that in this early period, going back to the time of the Seleucid Empire, the presence of Jews all throughout Asia Minor. So there's likely a Jewish population in Thyatira in the first century. One bit of evidence of this may be the fact that Lydia, a Gentile, is a God-fearer. She's there at the place of prayer where Paul meets her. So she has probably been influenced by a Jewish culture, a worshiper of the Jewish God, seeker of the Jewish God. Philippi did not have a synagogue. That's why they were meeting at that place by the river. So it's likely that she brought that with her from Thyatira. There's an inscription there, and I did fail to mention one other. There's a Sibyl, Sambathe. Sibyls were oracles, female oracles that were related to the Apollo cult, and in a Chaldean precinct, or perhaps Persian, or perhaps even maybe Jewish. Near there, you find some inscriptions, there you have this inscription from a Jewish man and his wife. They set up a sarcophagus for themselves in the same area. So there's a lot of debate in the literature about whether or not the Sibyl was associated with the synagogue or not, or if it was just a reference to the synagogue. I personally think they were distinct, but maybe in the same region. But so there you have a presence of the Jewish community there. Christianity arrived as early as the 50s with Paul's ministry in Ephesus and people spreading out into all of Asia. And then you also have later evidence of early Christians, in fact, quite important people, identifying themselves as Christian. Later, around I forget the year. Later, in the 2nd century, you have the Phrygian heresy, or Montanism, a prophecy cult, essentially. I won't say a cult, but teaching, where it dominated in Thyatira for about 112 years, and was later restored into the Orthodox tradition in 335. Very quickly, 2 images of the eyes with flaming fire, blazing fire, and the feet like burnished bronze. Now, Colin Hemmer argues that the burnished bronze, the kaklabino, was a unique term. It is a rare term. Bronze, copper, kokleos, metalworkers, common term. The word used in Revelation is rare. He argues it's related to a particular alloy that they made in Thyatira. I can't verify that or not. I think it has some strength, but I don't think it really matters. And that is, the imagery is very clear and pronounced. Even when you think about eyes as flames of fire, even that can send chills, because he sees. Nothing is hidden from his gaze. He can see into the darkest places, and he can see into our hearts and into our minds. There is nothing hidden from his gaze. Interestingly, I think the reference to sexual immorality, things that are sometimes done in dark, or in these cases maybe in open parties, that people might do in secret, are being clear to him. You also have the burnished bronze. I actually translate that as glowing, molten-looking bronze. In the Old Testament, I'm going to start doing that, Jeff. In the Old Testament, you have God as the one who sits over the refiner's fire, right? And I do some metal work as a hobby. My son and I made a forge, and we've been melting metal down and trying to make things, and it's such a great process. It's so much fun. But what do? Well, you put the metal into the crucible, and as it melts, anything that's not pure metal, right? Mostly I do aluminum because it's cheap and I can find it. But what's not pure aluminum rises to the surface, right? That slag, that dross. And as the metal is molten and glowing, you scoop that dross off and you purify it. Well, that is often the image of God. In his judgment, in the one who comes, and he refines his people. And I don't think, and once again with Dr. Wyma, I don't think the choice of the description of Christ coupled with the message is an accident. I think it's very intentional and very purposeful. So as you see this, in fact, I am going to go ahead and read the whole letter. So if you have Bibles, and I'm sorry I did not have the text up here, but if you have Bibles or on your phones, you can follow along. I'm going to be over a couple different places, but in 2:18 it says, to the church Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire, whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your deeds, your love, faith, service, and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely unless they repent of her ways. Verse 23. If you have a Bible, circle this verse. This verse to me is the verse. Verse 23. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each according to your deeds. Now I say this to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose on you any burden except to hold on to what you have until I come. To the one who is victorious and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations, and that one will rule them with an iron scepter and will dash them to pieces like pottery, just as I received authority from my Father. I will also give that one the morning star. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, once again, with the blazing eyes, connect that to verse 23. That he is the one who searches hearts and minds. So that, once again, that imagery is significant. In this, he gives what I divide as an oida A and an oida B. So the commendation, hey, good job, great work, right, is what I call the oida A. And I'm using oida from the Greek word, which means I know, because he uses that phrase, oida, I know. So he knows what's going on in his churches. He knows his people. I know, and he gives the good one, right? And essentially, he says, your good works, your increasing good works, they're developing, they're growing. What might have started out not so great, they've gotten better over time. And he lists the works that he has in mind. And he puts them in order of priority. And what's the first one he lists? Love. Which, if you go back to the church at Ephesus, what's their problem? Their love is decreasing. So, I often skip over the positive for Thyatira because it's just like one little verse. But don't miss it. Because Jesus is saying, no, you're doing some things good and you're growing in these areas. Great job. But then we get to the oida B, where then it becomes very, very extensive. And he mentions that they tolerate. Now, once again, that word tolerate is an interesting word because it's more than just that they let her in. But it almost implies that they allow her, and they're maybe not even sure if she's a true prophet or not, so they don't want to criticize her, right? They're welcoming her in, and they're allowing her into her midst, and her teaching is spreading and gaining an influence. And he calls her Jezebel. That is not her name. We don't know her name. Jezebel is a code word, just like Balaam. Balaam, the pagan prophet who was hired to curse the children of God in the desert, who then spoke blessings. And then Jezebel, the Phoenician queen who Ahab marries, and she outlaws the worship of God. Not only does she outlaw the worship of God because Baal and Asherah are the one true God, fertility cult and so forth, Baal's god of the storms, and so this is an agrarian society where you need water and fruitfulness of your fields. She begins to hunt down the prophets of God to kill them. Y'all know the story. So both of these instances, both with Balaam, because according to what we find in the Pentateuch, Balaam, then after he gives his prophecies, he goes out and sets up an idol and causes the children of Israel to commit idolatry and sexual immorality. Same thing with the worship of Baal and Asherah, same thing with this, is worshiping God is not the priority, exclusive worship of God, but rather compromise with idolatry. And always in the worship of these idols and these pagan religions, sexuality and sex was a very big part of that. And so you find that they tolerate her. Now let's just talk about this for a minute. Both David Owney and Charles Hill have written 2 excellent books on the movement of prophets and prophecy in the early church. It was a very common practice. We even see this in the book of Acts with Agabus, remember, who speaks the word of the Lord. Most of these prophets were itinerants. The Didache gives very specific instruction. Prophet comes in, welcome them. Treat them as a prophet. Listen to them. Do what they say. But watch them. If they stay more than 3 days, they're false prophets. Just kick them out. If they charge you money, they're false prophets. Kick them out. So in the early centuries, right, prophets were a very common part. Here, she seems to be somebody who's local, probably one of the female members of the church. You do find both male and female prophets in the early church. And so it's not that she's a woman. That's not the problem. It's what she is teaching them, which I believe is compromise. Compromise for the sake of participation in the local trade guilds, worship the patient gods and goddesses, and all that goes with it. And just once again, I have 5 children. I love my family. And I'm thankful for my job, and I'm thankful to be able to put food on the table. But there are times when I think about that. What does it mean if I were to follow Christ, and it meant that nobody would shop at my store? I don't have a store, but nobody would buy my merchandise. I couldn't participate. I couldn't make money. And you find economic persecution as part of what's going on there, especially with the mark of the beast. So being able to participate and make a living and function was intimately tied into involvement in these collegia and these guilds. And I think she's saying basically, you can be a Christian and participate. There's no problem. And that is what John is very, very, through Jesus, is very clear on. That is not okay. Exclusive worship of Christ and Christ alone, at all costs, is the message of Revelation. Even if it means you struggle, you hurt, you don't fit in. Even if it means you're ousted. And you see the patience of Christ. I've given her time to repent, but she doesn't want to. So I'm going to cast her on a bed, a sick bed of suffering, and those that commit adultery with her. Now herein, adultery here is not that they were literally having sex with her, but rather it's spiritual adultery. Rather than being faithful to their true bridegroom, they're merging and compromising and being unfaithful to their covenant Lord. And then, verse 23, once again, therein I think you have everything in all 7 messages. Why does he judge them? Why does he deal with them the way? Especially the severity of it. I will strike her children dead. I don't think this is her physical children, but rather a reference to those who follow her teachings. You find this language in other places. And so he's saying basically, I'm going to deal with her. She's going to suffer. She's going to have consequences. Those that are part of her teaching and her teaching ministry, I'm going to deal with that. And those who follow it, if they don't repent, if they don't turn away from that and turn to exclusive worship of Jesus, I will strike them dead. Yo, that's serious. Why? So that everybody in the churches will know that I evaluate and investigate all of you. I know exactly what's what. And there you have the call to the overcomers. Those who overcome are those who follow the Lamb at all costs. Those who follow him faithfully and endure through it all. Very briefly, the promise at the end is a fascinating one. It merges Psalm 2 with the Messianic Psalm of the coming king who will rule with an iron scepter. Nobody will disobey him. He is King of Kings, and he will deal with the nations according to their sins. And then you also have the reference to the morning star. I want to go into all the interpretations, even the deep things of Satan, but because I know you're hungry, I'm not going to belabor that. But I'll say this, the morning star is an interesting reference. It's highly debated. Nobody knows exactly what the reference is. There's at least four. The most natural one that people often allude to is Venus. The planet Venus was referred to as the morning star because it was visible in the sky just before dawn. So some people say, oh, it's Venus. Well, I don't think that's all that it is. Some people put to Daniel 12:3 in the coming resurrection where the righteous will shine like stars for eternity, which is nice. Some people mix it with the Balaam oracle that's called the star and the scepter prophecy, that there's a star coming out of the people that will rule with an iron scepter. And that's possible, a coming of the Messianic kingdom. But most likely, at least the most near identification is Revelation 22:16, where Jesus says, I am the bright morning star. So not only will they share in the rule and reign of Christ over the new creation, over the nations, but they will also receive Christ and be with him in that intimate relationship. But the language of the morning star is what I want to highlight on, and that is this. It's dark. Not right now, but it's dark. Times are dark. When you're marginalized, oppressed, and there is no real sense of rights, it's easy to despair. There's a couple times during the pandemic, it felt like a despair. The loneliness, the isolation, and often just before dawn, it's darkest. And so within this, he is saying, hang on, because the dawn is coming. Thank you.